I was sleeping heavily in the narrow upper berth of that third-class carriage of a dated Soviet train traveling east along the Trans-Siberian Railway. My instinct, motivated by a desire to stretch my muscles and nicotine yearning, aroused me as the train was coming to a halt. I slightly drew the curtain aside to have a peek out the window. It was early morning. We were at the Krasnoyarsk railway station. I placed a cigarette in my mouth, climbed down the berth, and began striding along the aisle towards the exit. Halfway through, I found myself sandwiched between an orderly mob of boarding Asians, forming a human chain of up to 40 individuals. They were hauling a heap of suitcases and cardboard boxes from the platform into the carriage, raising quite a clatter in the process. The last ones on the line were cramming them on the racks and under the seats. I had to laboriously jostle my way past them to reach the platform. I assumed they were villagers from northern China, bringing in merchandise from Russia. The whole Asian gang, together with a few more Russian passengers, were eventually ensconced inside the train, and the hubbub subsided. "Zahodim! Zahodim!" The conductor's voice resounded sharply over the now half-vacant platform, aimed at me and a handful of more passengers still lingering outside the train. I tossed the butt into the bin and climbed the steps back into the carriage. Shipping and logistics. Getting back to my place, I found the opposite seat occupied by one of those newly boarded Asians. He was a man in his 50s or late 40s. His stature was small, even for Asian standards. He was already undressed and was sitting crouched with his feet on the seat, wearing only a pair of shorts. A hefty suitcase was lying on the little table between us. "Shang, Shang," I began repeating to him while pointing alternately between his bag and the empty spot on the upper rack with my index. He let off a slight smile after the few repetitions. It took him to understand what I meant. With me giving him a hand, we lifted the heavy article and settled it in its proper place. Consecutive time zones as if across suburban stations, we got to gradually get better acquainted with each other and had several short conversations. During the day's calmest hours, when most of his comrades were either asleep or dozing in their seats, utilizing his rudimentary Russian, a tiny notebook with a handwritten Korean-Russian dictionary he kept hidden in his jacket, and Google Translate on my mobile when bandwidth was present. We engaged in communication exchange. He revealed particulars about his countrymen's situation, things he apparently yearned to say to some of those uncanny inhabitants of the allegedly evil, capitalist imperialist outer world, Eastern Europeans. One of the first things he told me was that there was a snitch among them. He was undercover. No one knew who he was. but he definitely was there, working and living together, with the rest of the team as if a perfectly normal member of it, but covertly assigned with the task to visit the secret police after their return and denounce any reactionary behavior on the part of his colleagues, selling the misdoers freedom or life for a bonus or favor. Speaking too much with a foreigner was, of course, misdoing of the severe kind. That's why he had to be highly cautious while carrying out his communication with me. They were there for work. He spoke about an obscure agreement between their state and Russia, whereby the former has agreed to send over cheap workers to man the latter's massive construction projects. This was his 4th time in Russia for such a working trip. Depending on the project, they stay between 2 months and a year each time. They always work hard, 7 days a week, 17 to 20 hours a day. Eastern Europeans. The work is depleting, but they earn money, so they endure it. The Russians pay 500 reals per day for each worker. Half of it is paid directly to the North Korean government, and only the other half is paid to the worker. He was aware that this was a humiliatingly low wage for the capitalist world standards. However, he was still reasonably satisfied with getting hold of any amount of money whatsoever. In their country, they work as hard only to receive back their means of subsistence. They never are given any money. With the money he earns working in Russia, he will afford to buy something other than necessary for his kids. At some point, he carefully extracted a photograph out of his jacket pocket and handed it to me. Under the table, it was a couple with 2 daughters posing under a portrait of Kim Jong-un. My family in our apartment, he described what I'm seeing as an extra means of security. They purposely select only workers who have a family to send abroad. It would anyhow be nearly impossible for anyone to escape. They live guarded inside the construction site. They are fed there and never are allowed to leave for any place. Even if they managed to run away, they wouldn't go far. Not speaking the local language and with absolutely no knowledge of how a capitalistic society functions, it wouldn't take long before they get arrested by the Russian police and deported back home to face execution. However, keeping their families back for pawn guarantees that even the slightest thought of escape is eliminated upon its inception. Eastern Europeans. Aside from speaking about his life, he was also keen to know about mine. He asked me different questions about how we work, what we earn for it, what we can obtain with what we earn, and many others concerning how we live in general. He was particularly curious about the internet, that baffling miracle thing. They've been hearing rumors of taking over the outer world. I tried to explain to him simply what the web is, about and demonstrated some of its applications on my mobile phone, but he seemed mystified and somewhat more perplexed than before, not being able to fathom what all this implied. On the last evening of the trip, I went to have a chat with a new girl who joined in the carriage. When I returned to my seat, he asked me where she was from. From South Korea, I replied. You should be able to understand each other, right? Why don't you go talk to her? Standardized and admissions tests. No. I must not talk to her. That would be very wrong, he uttered out from a stunned countenance. Why so? I asked rather stupidly. Ideology stood written on that part of the notebook's page he pointed his finger at. Throughout the previous days, he had kept a cautious and conservative stance every time. I tried to bring forth the subject of his country and its regime, basically meeting my inquiries with indifferent silence. But on this last evening, he showed a different mood. Perhaps he'd been waiting for it to manifest his honest perspective. When I asked him to know what about that ideology of his, he furtively passed me the notebook. Words like poverty, repression, fear, violence, injustice stood on it, followed by a complete sentence. You must help. Your country must help. The world must help. Standardized and admissions tests. We looked at each other silently and intently for a length of time. We bid each other good night, but not goodbye. As I expected, they would also get off at Vladivostok. I climbed up to my berth. He fixed his underneath. Sometime in the middle of the dark night, I abstractedly registered that same hubbub that took place during their boarding, repeating. When I woke up, a few hours later, still dark, my co-passenger and his colleagues were not there anymore. They were dropped off at some obscure station shortly before we arrived in Vladivostok. They must have been boarded on some other train to bring them back to their homes and everyday lives. The story you've just read is part of my Real Stories of Real People collection, where I recount encounters with remarkable characters I've met on the road. You can read the whole series on my blog here, and if you'd like to take them with you on your e-reader or as a physical book and support my work, you can get the book on Amazon for the price of a coffee. Books and literature. Across Siberia in a train carriage half occupied by North Korean slave workers. Image generated by Bing. Across Siberia in a train carriage half occupied by North Korean slave workers.